Good day. Last 24 hours have been perhaps some of the most important in the conflict in Ukraine, both because of developments on the battlefronts and also because of some important political military developments amongst the Western powers, in particular a clear disagreement about the question of supplies of weapons to Ukraine, which has now manifested itself at a meeting in Ramstein. I'm going to discuss both in this program. I'm going to first do what I traditionally do, which is start with a discussion of what's actually going on the battlefields. Now, over the last 2 days, the Russian military appears to have launched some kind of advance in Zaporozhye region. And we've been getting a number of reports about the progress of this advance, and I'm going to start with what a Russian official or Russian appointed official, Vladimir Rogov, is saying about it. And this is what he first of all has to say about the nature of the advance in Zaporozhye. And he said that early this morning, and he is, as I said, a senior official in the Russian Zaporozhye appointed government. He said, in the past 24 hours, our forces have advanced 7 kilometers deeper. At least 7 settlements are in the process of final liberation. And he then went on to say that Ukraine appears to be experiencing a sharp shell shortage, including a severe shortage of 155mm NATO shells. And then Vladimir Rogov went on to say that Russian forces are suppressing Ukrainian positions at the contact lines of Orekhov, Gulyapolye, and the settlement of Kamenskoye. Orekhov, Gulyapolye, Kamenskoye, suppression of Ukrainian firing positions in these settlements is in process. A constant fire contact is underway. Our tanks, artillery demolish Ukrainian positions. These settlements are located near the city of Zaporozhye. This is, as I've discussed before, a big industrial city in eastern Ukraine on the eastern bank, mainly on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, though I understand that there are parts of it also on the west bank. But anyway, it's a big industrial city, much bigger than any of the other cities we've been talking about, and a key part of the Ukrainian economy. And he says these settlements are located near the city of Zaporozhye, currently under Ukrainian control. And Rogov is saying that once Russian forces take control of the settlement of Lobkovoye, which in fact the Russian Ministry of Defense has said is under Russian control, and 4 settlements near Orekhov, representatives of the Kiev regime, this is Rogov's interpretation, consider it possible that Russian forces will approach Zaporozhye. And then Rogov, and I'm going to read what he now says. I'm not sure that any of this is true. This part of what he's saying is true, but I'll pass it on now since I'm reading other parts of what he's saying. But he says, the panic among representatives of Zelensky's regime is considerable now. All phones are hot. They inquire in the Ukrainian armed forces how things proceed when it is time to leave already. This is what is happening, whether it is time to leave already. In other words, evacuate Zaporozhye. This is what is happening constantly now at the level of the so-called governor and everyone who has contacts in the Ukrainian armed forces. So if we believe Vladimir Rogov, then the Ukrainian government is in a panic about this Russian advance in Zaporozhye, and it could be, or perhaps is, intended to capture Zaporozhye city, a city which before the war had a population of something like 750,000 people. allegedly. That's fallen to around 400,000. Major industrial centre, and there is supposedly panic about this. Now, I have to say, I take all of that about panic in Kiev, about the potential loss of Zaporozhye, with a heavy pinch of salt. But others, Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama, for example, are saying that there is a lack of strong Ukrainian forces in this area. He says that the military land deployment map, sympathetic to Ukraine, shows just 3 territorial defense brigades covering a 100-kilometer long southern defense line. These brigades are infantry rich but not mobile. They have only little heavy equipment. The Ukrainian 65th Mechanized Brigade is the only capable force in the area. It is screening Zaporozhye city, but has been heavily bleeding in its positions for quite a while. Well, I ought to say that the British Ministry of Defence disagrees. They've published a report which says that there are large Ukrainian forces concentrated in Zaporozhye region, and that the Russians have also got large forces concentrated in Zaporozhye region. However, Bernhardt does at least give a source for his information, which is the military land deployment map. The British Ministry of Defence doesn't. So on balance, I prefer Bernhardt's analysis here to that of the British Ministry of Defence. But anyway, I just set this out. I set out what the two contrasting claims are. Now, I don't know what Russian intentions are in terms of this advance. Is it a reconnaissance, a powerful reconnaissance in force? Are the Russians probing Ukrainian defences in Zaporozhye? It's been suggested that most of the territories that the Russians have occupied are in the so-called grey zone. In other words, they're contested places in a kind of no man's land. They're not Ukrainian, they're not heavily defended by the Ukrainian forces. Others suggest that this is in fact the actual start of the big Russian offensive talked about by people like Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin, in which case, by the way, it's more likely intended to cut off supply lines to Ukrainian troops in the Donbass, supply lines which pass through Zaporozhye on their way eastwards towards the Donbass, and perhaps ultimately to try to move, if one wants to project further and look at more ambitious plans, to cut off the Ukrainian forces in Donbass completely by advancing further north to a town called Pavlograd. I'm not going to try and guess any of this. I don't think any of us yet knows. But what I will say is this. Apparently, we will get a clearer sense of what the Russians are trying to do in Zaporozhye from judging what, if any, decision they make with respect to a town called Orekhov. Orekhov is not a big place. Again, it had a pre-war population of around 14,000, but it's obviously a town rather than a village, and apparently there is some kind of Ukrainian garrison there, and it does seem likely that if the Russians do indeed advance towards Orekhov, try to capture this town, encircle it perhaps. Vladimir Rogov yesterday was talking about encircling Orekhov, perhaps capturing it. Then perhaps we would be justified in talking about a major Russian offensive in Zaporozhye region. And if Bernhardt is right, and as I said, I think he probably is, then it does seem as if there is a scarcity of Ukrainian forces defending this part of the front line, despite the fact that there was all that talk a few weeks ago about a big Ukrainian offensive towards Melitopol or perhaps even Mariupol, towards the Sea of Azov, in other words, to cut off the Russian land bridge to Crimea. It seems that the fighting in Bakhmut, the slow motion Ukrainian collapse around Bakhmut, has caused the Ukrainian military to transfer all its best troops from places like Zaporozhye to try to hold the line in Bakhmut, and that this has left a scarcity of strong forces in the Zaporozhye region, and that the Russians are perhaps now taking advantage of that, and perhaps if they find Ukrainian defences weak, they will press on, and as I said, we will have a clearer idea perhaps of what they're going to do over the next couple of days, if and when they reach Orekhov and decide what to do with that town. If they do take Orekhov, for the record, my own opinion is that they will probably not want at this stage to capture Zaporozhye city. As I say, it's a big city. There's a brigade of Ukrainian troops there, apparently. I would have thought that this is a defendable place. I doubt that the Russians want to get bogged down in street fighting in a place like that. I think that the theories of people like Lieutenant Colonel Vyshinin, that this would then be an advance to try to cut the communications lines to the Ukrainian grouping in southern Donbass, around Donetsk city, I think that is more plausible. But anyway, let's discuss why this is happening, because it seems to me that there is another possibility. And I speak now again as somebody who isn't much of a military analyst, who's not got a military background, but the general consensus is that the reason that we are witnessing this strong Russian advance in Zaporozhye region is because Ukraine has redeployed so many of its best troops to try to hold the line in Bakhmut. Now, perhaps the Russian purpose here is not so much to launch a big blistering advance, a big advance to Orekhov and beyond. It's to put pressure on the Ukrainian front lines, to force the Ukrainians to transfer troops perhaps away from the Bakhmut front to try to hold their positions in Zaporozhye, which are critical to their positions in southern Donbass and conceivably Zaporozhye city, which of course would then weaken their overall position, their continuing position in Bakhmut itself. Now, there's been actually more news about the situation in Bakhmut. It seems that there is now definitely fighting going on in Ivanovka or nearby. There are some reports that the road leading into Bakhmut from the west is becoming increasingly dangerous to use because the fighting on this road is becoming so close. There's also reports that the Wagner organization assault forces have broken into Krasnaya Gora, which is the village to the north of Bakhmut, lying between Bakhmut and Soledar, which sits astride the main road heading north from Bakhmut to Siversk. And moreover, there's also reports that the Wagner organization assault forces have advanced into Bakhmut itself, into the residential areas of Bakhmut, further into those residential areas from the north. And I have seen film which shows Russian artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions now in the center and west of Bakhmut city. The Russians are now shelling Ukrainian fortified positions in the western part of Bakhmut city itself, which suggests that the fighting is now effectively taking place all over Bakhmut city, and that the And this, of course, happening at the same time as the roads into Bakhmut city are in the process of getting cut off. So it looks like Ukraine is facing a major operational crisis in Bakhmut city, and in north of Bakhmut city we've also had more news, because there's a report that just came out short time before I made this video on Saturday morning, that the Wagner organization assault forces have now also captured another settlement north of Soledar, another settlement pushing forward closer towards Siversk itself. Perhaps the clearest sign of how dangerous this whole situation is becoming for Ukraine comes from the fact that even as we speak, Ukraine continues to insist that it controls Soledar and Kleshayevka. Kleshayevka, that village to the southwest of Bakhmut, which was on the way to Ivanovka. Now, I have to say that there's a dearth of photographic evidence from Kleshayevka, but Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner organization, when he says that Kleshayevka has been captured, he's nearly always a very reliable source. I mean, he may be all kinds of other things, but when he describes something that's happened on the battlefields, I have to say that up to now, I have no reason to doubt that what he says is true. And as for Soledar, well, there is an abundance of photographic evidence now that the Russians do indeed control Soledar. So the fact that the Ukrainian military, not just President Zelensky's government, are still insisting that they control Kleshayevka and that they control Soledar, to my mind, shows how difficult it is for them to face the fact that they've lost these places and that their entire military position in this part of Donbass is in the process of collapse. And there's another factor which points to the fact that Ukraine is now in deep operational crisis in Donbass. And that is that there's now more and more accumulating reports in the US media that the US military is strongly urging Ukraine to pull its troops out of Bakhmut. Apparently that advice is still going unheeded, which points to the enormous importance of Bakhmut to the battle, at least from Ukraine's conception of the battle. And I've discussed my own bafflement at Ukraine's insistence on defending Bakhmut in the face of all of these enormous odds. The fact that Bakhmut, as I said, was certain to fall sooner or later. I've been saying this, well, since August, I think. And I've also suggested that one important reason why Ukraine is finding it impossible just to retreat from Bakhmut, to abandon Bakhmut to the Russians, just as it is finding it impossible for the moment to admit to the fall of Soledar, is because the enormous investment that Ukraine has made in defending Bakhmut and Soledar, the enormous number of lives that Ukraine has spent trying to defend these two towns, all of this points to the reality that it will be very difficult politically for Ukraine to turn round and tell its people that after all those men have died trying to defend these places, that the Russians have managed to capture them after all. But it isn't just a case of Ukraine facing political and psychological problems if it loses Bakhmut and Soledar. There's been a actually brilliant article by somebody who calls himself Big Serge. I've no idea who he is exactly, but nonetheless, he has provided a long article, which, in my opinion, is one of the most brilliant overall surveys of the war. No less a person than Larry Johnson, CIA analyst, thinks the same, by the way. And it was through him that I became aware of this article, Larry Johnson. But anyway, Big Serge has provided what I think is a wonderful explanation, wonderfully clear explanation of the importance of Bakhmut. And I'm going to read it. I'm not going to read the entire thing that Big Serge has written, which isn't just about Bakhmut, but about the entire course of the war and the state of the war, because, well, it's on Medium, and I think you should perhaps go on Medium and maybe subscribe to Big Serge's Medium page. And, you know, but I'm going to read out some parts of what Big Serge says, and I'm going to focus on what he says on Bakhmut. The first is this. He says, the Bakhmut axis is being spun to Western audiences as a perfect synthesis of all the tropes of Russian failure. In a nutshell, Russia is suffering horrible casualties as it struggles to capture a small town with negligible operational importance. British officials, in particular, have been highly vocal in recent weeks, insisting that Bakhmut has little to no operational value. And he's absolutely right about the British officials. And can I just say that I am deeply embarrassed by the standard of reporting in Britain, not just from the media about the war, but the steers that the British media are getting from the Ministry of Defence, about which I'm not going to say more. And anyway, to continue with what Big Serge says, the truth is the literal opposite of this story. Bakhmut is an operationally critical keystone position of in the Ukrainian defense, and Russia has transformed it into a death pit, which compels the Ukrainians to sacrifice exorbitant numbers of men in order to hold the position as long as possible. In fact, the insistence that Bakhmut is not operationally significant is mildly insulting to the audience. I don't think it's just insulting to the audience, by the way. I think it is very insulting to the Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting to defend the place, and to the families of those soldiers who have died and wounded, either been killed or wounded, trying to defend the place. But that's my own view. It is mildly insulting to the audience, both because a quick glance at the map clearly shows it is at the heart of the regional road network, and because Ukraine has thrown a huge number of units into the front there. And then he says this, and this is where it begins to get interesting. Let's take a step back and consider Bakhmut in the context of Ukraine's overall position in the east. Ukraine began the war with 4 operable defense lines in the Donbass, built up over the last 8 years, both as part and parcel of the simmering war with the Donbass republics, but also in preparation for potential war with Russia. These lines are structured around urban agglomerations with road and rail links between each other, and can be roughly enumerated as follows. The Donbass is a particularly accommodating place to construct formidable defenses. It is highly urbanized and industrial. Donetsk was the most urban oblast in Ukraine prior to 2014, with over 90% of the population living in urban areas, with cities and towns dominated by the typically robust Soviet buildings, along with prolific industrial complexes. In fact, that's absolutely correct, and I would again repeat my long-standing comparison of Donbass. If you want to get some sense, I'm not pushing this analogy too far, but if you want to get some sense of the general topography, think of the Ruhr region of Western Germany. Ukraine has spent much of the last decade improving these positions, and the frontline settlements are riddled with trenches and firing positions that are clearly visible on satellite imagery. A recent video from the Avdiivka axis demonstrates the extent of Ukrainian fortifications, and we've seen many pictures. There's one series of fortifications which has been assessed as being 20 kilometers deep. And then he goes on, this is Big Serge again. So let's review the state of these defensive belts. The first belt, which ran roughly from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk to Popasnaya, was broken in the summer by Russian forces. Russia achieved a major breakthrough at Popasnaya and was able to begin the full roll-up of this line, with Lysychansk falling at the beginning of July. At this point, that's to say now, the front line sits directly on what I have labelled as the second and third Ukrainian defensive belts, and both of these belts are now heavily bleeding. The capture of Soledar has severed the connection between Bakhmut and Siversk, whilst around Donetsk, the heavily fortified suburb of Marinka has been almost completely cleared of Ukrainian troops, and the infamous keystone Ukrainian position in Avdiivka is being flanked from both directions. These positions are absolutely critical for Ukraine to hold. The loss of Bakhmut will mean the collapse of the last defensive line standing in the way of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which means Ukraine's eastern position will rapidly contract to its fourth and weakest defensive belt. The Slavyansk agglomeration is a far worse position for Ukraine to defend than the other belts for several reasons. First and foremost, as the belt farthest to the west, and thus the farthest from the February 2022 start lines, it is the least improved and least fortified of the belts. Secondly, lots of, shall we say, the good stuff around Slavyansk is east of the city, including both the dominating high ground and the major highways. All this is to say that Ukraine has been very anxious to hold the Bakhmut line, and this is a vastly preferable position to hold, and accordingly they have been pouring units into the sector. The absurd level of Ukrainian force commitment to this area has been well noted, but just as a quick refresher, publicly available Ukrainian sources locate at least 34 brigade or equivalent units that have been deployed in the Bakhmut area. Bernhard puts it at 27. Big Serge says 34. But anyway, Big Serge continues. Many of these were deployed months ago and are already shattered, but over the full span of the ongoing battle, this represents an astonishing commitment. And then he goes on to say that Russian forces, primarily Wagner, PMC and Lugansk militia units, have been slowly but surely collapsing this Ukrainian unit stronghold by making liberal use of artillery. And then he discusses at length how claims that the Russians have resorted to human wave tactics are completely wrong, and that it is artillery that has played the key role in this battle. And then he makes all sorts of comparisons with the Battle of Verdun in the First World War, which I'm not going to follow up with. But this gives you an idea. This is an overview of the importance of Bakhmut, from the importance of this Battle of Bakhmut, which has been provided, and I think it's the best one that I've seen. Now, let me repeat again, I am not an expert, a military person at all. I'm a complete civilian. But it has been obvious to me since at least August that Bakhmut was absorbing a disproportionate amount of Ukraine's forces. This was the big battle that was going on. Obviously, there were battles going on in Kharkiv region, where Ukraine launched a successful counteroffensive in September, though the number of Russian forces defending this area of Kharkiv region was thin, and there was also that counteroffensive in Kherson region, which Ukraine undertook, with forces probably less, however, than those it has committed to trying to defend Bakhmut. In fact, significantly less than the forces it has been using to defend Bakhmut. And I've discussed at length why, in my opinion, despite the recapture by Ukraine of Kherson city, overall, the Kherson offensive must be considered a strategic failure for Ukraine. They did capture Kherson city. They suffered heavy losses in doing so. They've not been able to establish a civilian administration in Kherson city, and the entire territory has turned out to be of little value, operational value, to them. So, the situation at the present time is that this battle of Bakhmut has been going on. Ukraine is clearly losing it. It's clearly suffering huge losses trying to defend Bakhmut. And I do wonder whether part of the purpose of this Russian advance in Zaporozhye is to try to put the Ukrainians in a position where they have to choose between defending Bakhmut and the line there, which is, of course, critical to them for the reasons Big Serge said, or whether they're instead going to have to give up ground in Zaporozhye region, which could be very difficult for them, both if Zaporozhye city is eventually attacked, perhaps more seriously still, if the Russians exploit whatever advantage they've achieved in Zaporozhye region to cut off Ukrainian supply lines to their forces in the southern Donbass. So that's where I think we are with the battle. So Big Serge has a lot to say. He talks about the difference or lack of difference that supplies of Western tanks would make. He makes, I think, some of the most measured and objective points here. He says that Western tanks and armoured vehicles would be a lot better than nothing, but they will not change the overall pattern of the war, and that certainly seems to be the Russian view. I'll come to the question of tanks shortly. He also talks importantly and interestingly about the overall state of the war, about the degradation, as he puts it, of the Ukrainian army, the enormous losses that he feels that it's suffered, the way in which the Russians have exploited the importance of Bakhmut to the Ukrainian defense lines in Donbass to bleed the Ukrainian army dry. So he's written a very fine analysis of, overall analysis, summary of the conflict. And as I said, if you want to follow it up, well, I'll provide a link, and I think you should read it yourself on his on Medium. Well, I think it's Substack, actually. I might be wrong there. But anyway, I will provide a link. So, Ukraine suffering heavy losses in Bakhmut and Zaporozhye region. And at the same time, we have this meeting going on in Ramstein. Now, it turns out that sometime last week, in other words, in the run-up to this meeting in Ramstein, the German intelligence agency, I believe it's the BND, gave a report to the Bundestag, the German parliament, in which they discussed the overall situation in the Ukrainian conflict zone. Now, I haven't seen the report, which I suspect is secret. It apparently does continue with some of the Western tropes. It appears to say that, Russian forces have been launching human wave tactics in Bakhmut and suffering heavy losses and all of those things. Things which, as I said, are either exaggerated or outright false, but it does appear to concede that Ukraine is losing, and losing in Bakhmut. And it does also appear to concede the importance of Bakhmut for the course of the overall war. And I can't help but think that this has played some role in the decisions that we've seen come out of Ramstein. Now, to recapitulate, a few days ago, Germany's defense minister, Mrs. Lambrecht, resigned. And I have to say, whatever criticisms one may make of her, it did seem to me very strange that she should have resigned literally in the run-up to this extremely important meeting in Ramstein. And there was rumours that the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, was looking to find another woman to replace Mrs. Lambrecht. But in fact, and very quickly, he appointed Mr. Pistorius, a SPD politician with a security background, to take over the defense ministry. And I have to say, I do wonder whether this German reshuffle might have been connected with the enormous pressures that have been exerted upon Germany to agree to the supply of main battle tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, to Ukraine. Because it's now becoming increasingly clear that the German military are very unhappy about the supply of main battle tanks, German main battle tanks, be they from Germany itself or from Germany's allies to Ukraine. And we've now had, as on top of General Fad and General Kuyat, and by the way, the person who sent me that link to this very interesting interview by General Kuyat, which I discussed at length in my video yesterday. This person has pointed out that General Kuyat is a real military officer. General Fad was more of a political soldier. Doesn't mean he isn't a professional officer, but General Kuyat was certainly somebody senior in the military hierarchy to General Fad, and General Kuyat, speaking out in the way that he did, carries perhaps even more, well, considerably more weight than what General Fad had to say. Well, since then, we've had further comments from the head of the Bundeswehr military union, Andre Wüstner. Now, again, I have to say, I haven't seen this whole interview. I haven't got a full text of this interview. I'm taking this, what's written, this quote from Slavyangrad, which is a Russian Telegram channel that I've discussed before. I've said that I have consistently found them reliable, and I'm sure that they're quoting Mr. Wüstner accurately. But this is what I understand Mr. Wüstner said, and he's the head of the Bundeswehr military union. And these are his quoted words. The Bundeswehr is actually naked. We are expected to have a severe shortage of weapons by 2025 due to the energy crisis. It is simply unprofitable for factories to sell weapons at the same prices, and if the cost is raised, the agency will not pull these purchases. What kind of delivery of tanks to another country can we even talk about? So here again, we see General Wüstner saying the Bundeswehr is in a terrible state. Why, in light of this, are we even debating supplies of Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukrainians? Well, that may be part of the explanation. But I do wonder whether behind this all there is the further factor of this report from the German intelligence agency that Ukraine is losing the war in Bakhmut which is a war that is so critical to the course of this whole conflict. And in fact, I do wonder whether German generals are coming round telling the political leaders, what is the logic of sending Leopard 2 tanks, be it from Germany or be it from our allies, if we're simply going to throw them away? Because at some point over the next few months, perhaps a year, Ukraine is going to collapse because its army is bleeding to death. It's been bleeding to death defending Bakhmut, and it's bleeding to death overall over the course of this war. It's not going to be able to sustain the struggle for very much longer, one way or the other, regardless of how many tanks we send. And realistically, we can only afford anyway a very few. So I wonder whether this is what is causing German politicians, German political leaders like Olaf Scholz. And it's interesting, by the way, that there seems to be a general hardening in Germany against the supply of these tanks. Public opinion in Germany seems to be shifting strongly against this idea. But whether, in fact, word is going around within the German political system that this war is being lost, and whether this is one of the major factors that's causing the Germans to have doubts about tank deliveries. Anyway, there is huge anger towards Germany from what you might call the NATO hardliners. There are reports that the United States is baffled by the German decision. The United States will not supply its own tanks, provided its reasons. It's insisting that the Germans will. The Germans say, why should we supply our tanks, which are in short supply, when you are not supplying yours? There seems to be a standoff. Mr. Pistorius was perhaps a tougher figure in facing off against the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and the British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace than Mrs. Lambrecht might have been, and maybe that was the reason why Mrs. Lambrecht was manoeuvred into resignation and Mr. Pistorius took over. I mean, these are guesses, but, consider the timing. Timing sometimes is very interesting, and I suspect it was very interesting in this case. So there was a row at Ramstein. Of course, we're not calling it a row, but there clearly was. And we see articles appearing in the British media. Always the British media is the most aggressive. Daily Telegraph has published an angry editorial talking about splits in NATO, helping Putin. This is the usual thing, that if we don't agree to escalate by supplying tanks to Ukraine, we're splitting NATO, and that helps Putin. When, of course, what is happening is that we're talking about rational decisions made by Germany. And we see also further pressure. The Netherlands is now talking about supplying F-16 fighter jets. Well, actually, they're not quite said that. They've said that they might consider supplying F-16 fighter jets. All options are open, supposedly. That's what they've always said. But again, the hardliners, the Americans, have come out and said, well, if the Dutch are talking about supplying F-16 fighter jets, then all of us should do. In other words, they're taking the words of a Dutch official and they've made those words seem rather stronger than perhaps they actually are. I'm not fully up to informed about all of the discussions that are taking place, but you can see that there's these big rows going on. At the same time, we're getting reports that the United States is advising Ukraine to hold off from launching any offensives at the moment. They need, apparently, to hold back, to train themselves up, to learn how to use these Bradley infantry fighting vehicles that they're being supplied, these Stryker wheeled vehicles. There's supposed to be a big meeting between Ukrainian and US military officials soon to plan whatever is to come. I have to say, again, given the realities of this war, given what is actually happening on the battlefields, about which, by the way, the media is not informing the Western public properly, I wonder whether, to some extent, what is now happening is that positions are being taken for the blame game that is to come, whether perhaps the Germans have been put in a corner over Leopard 2s because a narrative is now being constructed that if Ukraine is defeated, it's because Germany was unwilling to supply the necessary weapons for Ukraine to win the war, whether the Germans, for their part, are manoeuvring to say that this was an ill-conceived war which never should have been launched in the first place. That was what General Kuyat was saying. Whether, in fact, we're starting to see, at some level, perhaps even a subliminal level, people positioning themselves to prepare for the recriminations and the finger pointing which is to come. Now, I do want to make one further and very important point. The fact that Germany in Ramstein refused to provide Leopard 2 tanks does not, unfortunately, mean that Leopard 2 tanks will not at some point be supplied to Ukraine. The anger in Britain, the US, Poland, the Baltic states, amongst the hardliners, in other words, over this German refusal is enormous, and I suspect that over the next few weeks and months, the pressure on Germany is going to build and mount. We can already see a campaign of vilification against German leaders for their refusal to make these sort of decisions. We see, for example, this I'm now going back to the defense, the Daily Telegraph article that the last German chancellor from the left-wing SPD, Gerhard Schröder, ensured Russia's energy stranglehold on Europe. The new one, Olaf Scholz, has not seemed averse to doing the Russian president a favour either. And insinuations again that the Germans are somehow appeasing the Russians, that they are acting on Russia's behalf. There's an article again in the Daily Telegraph, Poland's bravery has humiliated Germany. We're going to have lots and lots of this sort of thing. And the Germans, for all kinds of reasons, have historically been very averse to finding themselves in a position where they are attacked by their Western allies in this way, where they are accused of splitting NATO and dividing the EU. Now, I'm not sure that in the face of all of this, despite all of the doubts that the Germans obviously have, that their will hold. In fact, if I was going to place any money on it, and I'm not a betting man, I would say the most likely outcome is that the Germans will crack, that they will agree at some point to provide some numbers of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. But it is nonetheless significant that despite all the pressure, they came to Ramstein and said no. That does, to my mind, show that the doubts are starting to grow. They're starting to be expressed in Germany. They're, by the way, also increasingly expressed in the United States as well. We see hints in other places that they're there too. The article that I discussed a few days ago in the Daily Telegraph, which basically criticised the supply by Britain of Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, suggesting that they were unsuitable for Ukrainian needs and that the technology of the Challenger 2s might be compromised if these tanks were to fall into Russian hands, as they might do. Well, that was noticed and provoked an angry response from some people. But again, it does suggest some degree of dissonance, or so it seems to me, behind the scenes, behind the facade of British unanimity about the war. So perhaps we're starting to see the point where doubts are starting to grow. It was interesting that Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Minister at Ramstein, for example, talked about the war being at a turning point. Well, perhaps it is. Perhaps if Bakhmut falls, perhaps if the Russians advance, perhaps if the Russian advance in Zaporozhye continues and accelerates, it might be that we are indeed at the kind of turning point that Lloyd Austin says it is, but perhaps not quite in the way that some people in the West would like to interpret his words. General Milley, the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has now come forward and said that it will be very, very difficult indeed for Ukraine to drive the Russians out of all of Ukrainian territory. He clearly doesn't think that this is a realistic plan, even though, for political reasons, he can't quite bring himself to say so. So we see perhaps accumulations of doubts. They're starting clearly, or so it seems to me, to come from the uniformed military in various countries, and perhaps these doubts reflect, or I'm sure in fact that they reflect, concerns about the actual situation on the front line. Well, what to do? I cannot imagine that sending Leopard 2 tanks or Bradley infantry fighting vehicles or Marder fighting vehicles or Challenger 2 tanks or any other kind of machine to Ukraine in the limited numbers that the West can apparently send is going to just change the ultimate direction of the war. The forces that the Russians are accumulating seem to me to be too powerful, and as several people have pointed out, that doesn't even remotely come close to tapping out Russia's overall reserves. If they need to, they can deploy even more forces than those that they have committed up to this point. So, what to do? Well, I've said this many times. If this is now heading towards a debacle, then both for political reasons and even humanitarian reasons, even more so for humanitarian reasons, talk peace, bring this war to an end, find a negotiated solution. It seems to me that is what the generals are saying. It's what General Milley apparently has been saying behind the scenes. It is what General Kuyat said in that interview I discussed yesterday. There's a famous incident from the Second World War, and it involved a German general, actually a Field Marshal von Rundstedt. And it allegedly took place on the 1st of July, 1944. It's uncertain whether this incident did actually take place. There's some doubts that it really happened, but there are eyewitnesses, or rather there were eyewitnesses, everybody involved now has long since passed away, who apparently corroborated it. On the 1st of July 1944, the German army reported back that a counterattack that they launched in Normandy against the Allies had been repelled. And Rundstedt, who was the overall German commander in the West, received a call from the German headquarters asking him what they should do next. And the story goes that Rundstedt responded, "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" Well, as I said, it may be apocryphal. It may be that those words were never said, or maybe they were said in a different way from the way that has been reported. But it does seem to me that that is where we are now. For the sake of international peace, for the sake of stability in Europe, for the sake of relations between the West and Russia, which have been smashed and torn asunder in the most dangerous ways, for the sake, above all, of Ukraine, which is bleeding by the day, let's make peace. Obviously, the conditions will not be as they might have been if we'd fulfilled the Minsk II agreement or had gone ahead with the agreements that were hammered out or were in the process of being hammered out in Istanbul last March and which we sabotaged. But better an unsatisfactory peace than a debacle. I would have thought that was obvious, and perhaps with the military now talking for it, the point will eventually come at some point in the next few months when that will finally break through and we will see the politicians start to pay attention. Well, that's me for the day. To remind you, all our programs can be found on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also join us. You can also go to our shop, and buy yourself the fabulous merchandise that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. We'll see what the Russians do, whether they are indeed heading for Orehov. We will see how long it takes before the Germans crack and agree, despite all their doubts and misgivings and the growing anger of the German military, before they finally decide to put aside their doubts and provide the Ukrainians with those Leopard 2s. Well, thank you for joining me again today. As I said, more from me soon.